that you have learned how to search and screen evidence, we are going to transition to the main focus of this course, the critical appraisal of the evidence. The critical appraisal of evidence is so critical, no pun intended, that we are going to spend multiple weeks reviewing how to appraise different types of evidence that you may have found while completing your literature search. This lecture will serve as an overview and introduction to the process of evidence appraisal. You will learn that, in general, the process of evidence appraisal involves assessing support for decision-making as well as quality. However, the specific action steps of the process of critical appraisal will vary based on the type of evidence you are appraising. Therefore, in the upcoming lectures, we will do deep dives in how to appraise each of pre-appraised evidence, single study evidence, and anecdotal evidence. For now, we will begin with our overview of what is critical appraisal. Following completion of this lecture, students should be able to identify the type of evidence a source is by using the Johns Hopkins evidence-based practice model appraisal selection algorithm. Students should be able to discuss the purpose of evidence appraisal in the Johns Hopkins evidence-based practice model. Students should be able to describe the fundamental components of evidence appraisal within the Johns Hopkins evidence-based practice model, and students should be able to explain methods to increase the objectivity of critical appraisal and analysis, despite analysis being inherently subjective. Before we discuss critical appraisal, I wanted to summarize where have we come from. Up until this point, what we have done is you have identified and described a practice problem. Based on your identified and described practice problem, you developed a practice question or an evidence-based practice question that would guide your review of the literature. You then did a deep dive into the literature to find out what information is available on this topic. And at this point, you have gathered all of the pertinent evidence on your topic of interest. And now we are at the point of what do we do with that evidence? How do we take this large pile of articles that you have in front of you or the documents you have saved on your computer? What do we do with them? How do we decide which ones to keep, which ones to let go? You may have 5 or 8 articles. Maybe you found 20 to 30 articles. How do we move forward? How do we critically appraise the articles? And that is where we are headed. As you may recall, finding and evaluating evidence is the cornerstone of evidence-based healthcare, as well as the second phase of the Johns Hopkins evidence-based practice PET process. Understanding the various types of evidence that you may have collected during your search of the literature is crucial, because the type or format of the evidence is what dictates how your team can use that evidence to inform their practice. Each type of evidence contributes uniquely to the overall picture of understanding best practice and answering your evidence-based practice question. If you have worked with the Johns Hopkins evidence-based practice model in the past, you likely recall the 5 levels of evidence, where evidence was grouped hierarchically. The Johns Hopkins model moved away from this hierarchical ranking in their 5th edition because of the limitations that an evidence hierarchy presents. Ranking evidence hierarchically is subjective, and the value of a type of evidence is actually not a fixed concept, but rather a contextual phenomenon that is specific to the evidence-based practice question. Therefore, we will take a little bit of time to briefly review the 3 types of evidence that are now recognized when using the Johns Hopkins evidence-based practice model. I know that you discussed types of evidence in detail in a previous module. However, I wanted to briefly review with you what specific types of literature may fall under each of the 3 broad categories of types of evidence. So let's take a moment to look at each of these. The first type is pre-appraised evidence, which is also referred to as filtered or secondary literature. And this is evidence that describes a group of individual studies that have undergone a methodical process for collection and critical evaluation by teams of investigators and content experts that have analyzed the quality and clinical utility of the evidence. This type of evidence allows clinicians to rely on context and research method experts to process literature and generate recommendations that serve as independent support for decision-making and healthcare. So, examples of pre-appraised evidence would include things such as clinical practice guidelines, which you may see abbreviated as CPGs, literature reviews with a systematic approach, also called LRSAs, and evidence summaries. The second type of evidence are single studies with a formal study design. These use systematic inquiry to answer questions or solve problems. Single studies are reports that are written by an author or team of authors that recount their scientific or clinical experience. This form of evidence comes in many types that can be categorized as quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods. Therefore, when we go into detail on critical appraisal, we will break down the different types of single study evidence. So, evidence that counts as single study evidence would be, as I implied, quantitative studies, qualitative studies, mixed method studies, as well as quality improvement projects that have a rigorous design. The third type of evidence is anecdotal evidence. Anecdotal evidence is published information that was not generated from a research study, but rather generated from personal, professional, or clinical experience. Anecdotal evidence may or may not be peer-reviewed. Examples of anecdotal evidence include expert opinions, chapters from books, position statements, program evaluations, and literature reviews that do not have a systematic approach. To appraise your evidence, you must first know what type of evidence a given article or piece of literature is. And while the previous slide may have made it sound very easy to identify the type of evidence, you will find that sometimes there can be a challenge to figuring out what exactly is this piece of evidence. Therefore, the best practice is to follow Appendix D of the Johns Hopkins Evidence-Based Practice Model and Guidelines, which is the appraisal tool selection algorithm. And I'll go ahead and walk you through that process. Begin by asking yourself if the piece of evidence is a clinical practice guideline, literature review, or evidence summary. If your answer to that question is no, then you either have a single study or anecdotal piece of evidence, and we will discuss that on the next slide. So for now, let's say you answered the first question yes. You now must ask yourself, is this based on a systematic and rigorous review of the evidence? Your answer to that question is going to let you know if this piece of evidence will provide independent support for decision-making or limited support for decision-making. If you answer no to systematic and rigorous review, then you have a literature review without a systematic approach, which is anecdotal evidence. If you answer yes to systematic and rigorous review, then you have a pre-appraised piece of evidence. Now, let's say on the previous slide, following the algorithm, you said no. You did not have a clinical practice guideline, literature review, or evidence summary. As I suggested, you either have a single study or anecdotal piece of evidence. So, which do you have? We begin with a question. Is this a report of a formal single study design? If you answer no, then you have limited support for decision making and an anecdotal piece of evidence. If you answer yes, then you must ask yourself, did the study team implement an intervention? If there is no intervention, you have moderate support for decision making and you have a single study. If you answered yes, you must ask yourself, was there explicitly stated and analyzed control group? If you answer no, you still have moderate support and a single study. If you answer yes, this piece of evidence provides you with strong support for decision making and is still a single study. Now, you may be wondering about this level of support for decision making. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes, but right now I wanted you to be able to go through the process of figuring out what type of evidence do I have, because that will guide you through which appraisal tool you will use. Once you have identified the type of evidence that each piece of evidence is, you are ready to begin appraising the evidence. In some of our upcoming lectures, we will talk about the specific process for appraising each type of evidence. Right now, we're going to focus on the overview of the general process of evidence appraisal. When using the Johns Hopkins model, the appraisal process has two fundamental components: determine the level of support for decision making and assess the quality of evidence to ensure adequacy. The level of support for decision making is generally determined by the type of evidence. However, when appraising the evidence, you also need to consider if the individual piece of evidence answers your evidence-based practice question. Furthermore, you should also double-check to ensure that the piece of evidence does not meet any of your exclusion criteria. Evidence that does not answer the evidence-based practice question or evidence that meets exclusion criteria is not appropriate to be used to provide support for decision making. The level of support of evidence can provide for decision making only holds true if the quality of the information within that piece of evidence is sufficient. Thus, you must conduct a quality appraisal of all evidence to critique not only how well the study or project was executed, but also how well it was reported. When we look at quality, we are looking at both a quality assessment and the risk of bias. You may hear these two terms used interchangeably. However, they are not synonymous. While both address efforts in the design, conduct, and analysis of a study to ensure the findings are valid and reliable, quality analysis evaluates the inclusion of these efforts, and risk of bias evaluates their implications on results. In other words, quality assessments look at the efforts made to avoid systematic errors, while risk of bias refers to how the flaws of a study may have impacted study results. Before we move on, I want to note that critical appraisal is subjective, and to do this process well requires advanced critical thinking skills, which is why we will be practicing it throughout this course. Therefore, it is best practice to always have two people review each piece of evidence and then compare your individual conclusions on the level of support for decision making and the quality of the piece of evidence. Also, I want to make it very clear, you cannot accurately appraise evidence by only reading the results section of an article. You must read the article in its entirety, and usually you are going to need to read the article more than once in order to perform a thorough and accurate critical appraisal. Let's now take a moment to circle back to the level of support for decision making. It may seem strange that we are talking about level of support before quality. Remember, level of support is based on the type of evidence, not the quality of the evidence. Thus, we can easily determine level of support before performing an in-depth quality analysis. Pre-appraised evidence that completely answers your EBP question and does not meet exclusion criteria provides independent support for decision making. This means you can make a practice change decision based solely off of a piece of pre-appraised evidence, provided there is no new evidence that has been published since that piece of pre-appraised evidence was completed. Pre-appraised evidence that only addresses part of your EBP question does not provide independent support for decision making. Instead, this evidence provides strong support for decision making. In other words, you cannot implement practice change based solely off of that one piece of evidence. Single studies with a formal study design provide strong support for decision making if they follow the design format of being a controlled trial, regardless of the use of randomization. Single studies with a formal study design that are interventional studies without control or observational study designs provide moderate support for decision making. Anecdotal evidence provides limited support for decision making. We will go into more detail about the level of support for decision making when we talk about each type of evidence. What is nice when appraising the level of support for decision making is that if you follow the decision tree in Appendix D of the Johns Hopkins model, you will be guided through determining the level of support based on the type of evidence you have, and in the case of single studies, the design of the evidence. Remember, just because a piece of evidence provides a certain level of support does not mean that piece of evidence should be used to guide practice change. We also need to examine the quality of the piece of evidence before adding it to our body of evidence to support practice change. We're now going to briefly talk about appraising the quality of evidence. Appraising evidence quality is inherently subjective. However, the Johns Hopkins model provides us with checklists that you should follow when appraising evidence quality. These checklists are found in Appendix E of the Johns Hopkins Evidence-Based Practice Model and Guidelines. The checklists are a tool that provides you with a series of questions that, while reviewing the article, you should read and answer as yes, no, unclear, or non-applicable. When you are done reviewing the article, you should look at how you answered the questions in general. The challenge here is there is no predetermined number of yes or no answers that say that an article is adequate quality or inadequate quality. Therefore, it is always best to have at least 2 individuals analyze the article, compare your answers, and compare your conclusion about adequate versus inadequate quality. I also want to make a note here that we are no longer ranking levels of quality. In previous editions of the Johns Hopkins model, we ranked quality as A, B, or C. We are no longer doing that. Now, quality is simply adequate or inadequate. And once you have determined that an article is of adequate quality, you then include it in your body of evidence. If an article is inadequate quality, you exclude it from your body of evidence. You will notice if you look at the tools, the evidence appraisal tools, at the very top of the evidence appraisal tool, there is a data collection table. Only complete this table after you have appraised the quality of the evidence and found it to be adequate. If this is the case, go back, fill out this part of the data collection table, as it will help you when you move forward into synthesis. If the article is found to be of inadequate quality, you will exclude it from your body of evidence. Do not complete the data collection table. Instead, make yourself a note as to the rationale for why you excluded this article. That will be very beneficial to you if this is a long-term project, to jog your memory of why you were not using a particular article. Again, similar to looking at levels of support, we will discuss quality appraisal in more detail while we go through each type of evidence. So, to kind of pool everything we've discussed together, each type of evidence is going to have specific action items for appraisal. When we are looking at pre-appraised evidence, we know this evidence provides us with independent support for decision making. Therefore, we're going to first assess pre-appraised evidence for suitability. Is it recent enough and similar enough to our evidence-based practice question to be used independently to guide practice change? If the answer to that question is yes, then we will assess the quality using the checklist from Appendix E1. For single study evidence, we know that this evidence is going to provide us with strong or moderate support for decision making based on the study design. So therefore, we will look at the design of the study and then assess the quality using the appropriate checklist from Appendix E2. And finally, with anecdotal evidence, we know that this evidence is going to provide us with limited support for decision making, and we will assess the quality using the checklist from Appendix E3. So in summary, this is the basics of critical appraisal. Before you can critically appraise your evidence, you must do your exhaustive literature review and gather all of your evidence. Then, go through each piece of evidence and identify what type of evidence it is. Using the type of evidence, and in the case of single study evidence, the research design, you will be able to determine the level of support for decision making. Use the checklists in Appendix E to assess the quality of the evidence. And then, because evidence appraisal is a subjective process, it is always best practice to review your decisions with a team and develop a consensus to include or exclude each article. Remember, there is more to this process than the steps that I have discussed here. Each type of evidence will have specific considerations for appraisal, and we're going to dive into those over the next couple of lectures. So stay tuned.